Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. We're going to have a very full show for you. It means two great guests. It's Connor Riley. It's Jake Fromm. Both those discussions will be really good. We've also got some more today on those Philly Dawgs that won the Super Bowl. Another way in which we can kind of prove that, hey, this really is something pretty meaningful. This is not just something we're talking about for fun. The people in Philadelphia themselves seem to be of the belief that the dog culture brought from Athens up to the north, it seems like they are crediting a lot of that for the success they've been able to enjoy. And in addition to that, can't help but think about one of the prominent members of the Eagles, Nolan Smith. If he was still here in Athens, what might he be saying about the 2025 season for the Georgia Bulldogs? I think we have an idea about this. I think it's going to be good, so we'll use that as a nice starting point to begin our discussion here today. We're glad that you're with us for it, of course. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by ServPro, cleaning, restoration, construction.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
We have had so much fun with the presence of those Georgia Bulldogs with the Philadelphia Eagles that we're not able to kind of get this done in just one day. Talked a lot about it yesterday. Wanted to come back and talk a little bit more about it today. And coming up in a few minutes, one of the things we're going to kind of get into is, I think, pretty definitive proof that this whole thing of the Georgia Bulldog influence on the Philadelphia Eagles is not just something that we have made up. We're not just trying to use a phrase I think I used yesterday, sort of shoehorn ourselves into this story. I think the Philly people themselves, and they got the right to sort of tell their own story however they want to, given the fact they are the world champs, they themselves are giving a lot of credit to these Georgia Bulldogs for that success. We'll give you more on that here coming up in a moment. And we'll talk about a way in which I think that's sort of opening up a different conversation for us here locally that I don't know in recent years we were necessarily all that allowed to have. We may be more allowed to have this discussion. I'll get to that here coming up in a couple of minutes. Let me instead, though, start with this, which is when you look at what happened for Philadelphia this year, winning the Super Bowl, the impact that former Georgia players made, can't help but think a lot about Nolan Smith. Man, I really, really like Nolan Smith. You know, I just think that for whatever reason, we played a lot of stuff from him last week from like Super Bowl opening night and things like that. Nolan just has a way of oftentimes saying like the exact right thing and sort of striking the right, I'm talking about in many cases, the perfect emotional tone for whatever a moment requires, that he really is. And now listen, I'm saying this as someone kind of on the outside looking in, but to the best that I can tell from my vantage point, he's like one of the best vocal leaders I've ever seen. Just so good at sort of establishing the exact right narrative at the exact right time. And obviously Nolan was a big part of the 2021 Georgia defense and the historic nature of that defense. And goodness knows that everything has been sort of written about them. And a lot of because of Jordan Davis and, you know, guys like that, a lot of the 2021 influence is on the Philadelphia Eagles. But actually, one of the coolest moments for Nolan in a Georgia uniform, and many of you, of course, remember this, one of the coolest moments for Nolan in a Georgia uniform is what he did in 2022. And this is sort of a joke now, I guess, but during the time, I mean, I think there was a lot of sort of seriousness to this. That 2022 Georgia team, trying to come back and win a second straight national championship, was sort of trying to grab hold of any extra motivation it could find for itself. Kirby Smart talks a lot about complacency, and Georgia in 2022 did not want to fall victim to complacency. So, you know, Georgia and Nolan Smith seemingly kind of led the way on some of this, was inventing a lot of enemies. Now, we've also said that there's revisionist history in the part of the media, because sometimes the media likes to rewrite the story to make themselves seem more certain after the fact they were in the moment. In other words, there were plenty of doubters, I think, for Georgia as it pursued that second straight national championship in 2022. But no matter how many there were, Nolan Smith was also happy to kind of exaggerate some of that and embellish it, make it a little bit worse, a little bit more pronounced than perhaps it was, famously telling the entire Georgia team, apparently on a repeated basis, that Georgia was going to go 7-5. That's what the media was saying, that Georgia was going to go 7-5. And then once the hay was in the barn, once Georgia had won that 2022 national championship, Nolan apparently then sort of felt free to kind of come clean and admit, no, the whole thing was basically just made up. You may remember, Nolan went on, there's a website called Saturday Down South, one of their guys named Connor O'Gara. Connor had Nolan Smith on his show shortly after the 2022 season, and in that discussion, Nolan basically admitted, that this was kind of a work of fiction, a fabrication on his part, exaggerating the degree to which that Georgia had faced doubters during that particular season. This is funny. It's about a minute. Let me let you hear the exchange between Nolan Smith, the podcast host named Connor O'Gara, where Nolan basically comes clean on his 2022 motivational ploy.
You know that nobody said that you guys were going 7-5 last year, right?
Yes. Yeah. You know, you got to create the own narrative, man. Sometimes, you know, you got to put the chip on your own shoulder. But we did have a humongous target on our back, as we saw in the Missouri game.
That's very true. Very true. But I just needed that to be known of, like, we're not that dumb. We're dumb. We're not that dumb.
Yeah, you know, sometimes you got to juice it up for the guy, especially when you're old man last year. I just wanted everybody to know. I said it the whole summer. They're going to think we're going 7-5, guys. They ain't even thinking about a 2P. So
you made that entire thing up. You just picked that out of the air. You're like, all right, I'm just going to throw 7-5. That sounds disrespectful enough.
Yeah, 7-5 is like disrespectful enough. And that's what like Coach Smart did. I think not to disrespect any of the other teams, but I think Coach Smart went like 8-4, like his first year. So I was like, yeah, 7-5 though sounds better, and it sounds better off the tongue. 7-5.
You're exactly right.
7-5. They say we're going 7-5, guys.
We've played this clip before on the show. I just think it's so funny. Nolan Smith is such a magnetic personality, I guess. And I do believe that nature of motivation for Georgia really worked. Not the belief that people were saying they were going to go 7-5. That just sort of became kind of the rallying cry phrase, I think. But Georgia did sort of feed off the fact that in the official polls to begin the 2022 season, Georgia was only preseason number 3, behind Ohio State, behind Alabama. The entire world lined up to pick Tennessee to beat Georgia that season. You remember that kind of the high-profile home game that took place that November. The entire world was seemingly picking Tennessee to win that game. That there was legitimate doubt about Georgia. Maybe not 7-5 type doubt, but legitimate doubt nonetheless. And Nolan wisely used that as fuel, and then the whole 7-5 thing kind of became just sort of the humorous punchline and catchphrase around all of that. But there was legitimate doubt, and Georgia fed off of it. Now, here's what I don't know. I don't know if Nolan Smith knew that in addition to kind of creating a narrative that would push back against the team's potential for complacency, I don't know that he realized that he was also helping kind of rewrite a storyline that existed around the Georgia fan base at the time, too. And this is one of those things where it's almost unpleasant to go back and remember this. A lot of people have tried to delete old posts or kind of forget stuff existed. But in the aftermath of Georgia winning the national championship in 2021, if we're completely honest, not everybody was happy. It's so weird to watch this play out in real time. But not everybody was happy. Much the same way there's this kind of internal debate among a lot of Georgia fans right now about what Georgia perhaps does or doesn't have at offensive coordinator with Mike Bobo. People citing in some cases some justifiable evidence to suggest Georgia needed to have been better offensively in 2024, but other folks citing justifiable evidence that, hey, the program is still in good shape. This was still an SEC championship year, an argument that takes place in some cases in good faith with people sort of on both sides of it, citing facts as a way of making their case here, making their opinion known, that you had some of that going on back before the 2022 season too, where a lot of people were divided about what Georgia did and didn't have at quarterback with Stetson Bennett. And frankly, not all of those arguments and discussions were in good faith, the same way that maybe not all of it today is necessarily in good faith either. This was sort of a divided fan base, that some people, after having seen Georgia win a championship for the first time in 40 years, spent a lot of the offseason arguing in social media and message boards and comment sections like ours and things like that about, whether or not Georgia had any chance of being good again with Bennett as quarterback. And of course, history would suggest that Stetson Bennett goes down as one of the all-time great quarterbacks in program history, became a Heisman finalist that year. But in between those two national championship seasons, a lot of Georgia fans weren't quite so sure about that. And so in a roundabout way, when Nolan Smith kind of created the fuel of everybody's doubting us, nobody believes in us, that gave Georgia, and in some cases Georgia fans who kind of became aware of how Georgia was being fueled by this sort of thing, that gave Georgia the chance to turn what was a little bit of an internal squabble and kind of find an external enemy. And I think that was really valuable. Instead of debating with all of the departures from the 2021 defense if Stetson Bennett was going to be good enough to lead Georgia, instead of fighting among themselves about that, all of a sudden DawgNation could kind of turn all of its energy to the people who seemingly didn't believe in Georgia. And honestly, I think that really worked. And frankly, it made the 2022 season a lot more fun than otherwise would have been. Now, all of that is simply a setup to ask this. If Nolan Smith were still around here in 2025, what would he be saying? And how would he use some of that 7-5 magic about this team here this year? And whether, on purpose or accidentally, how could he help take a fan base that right now, if we're being completely honest, I don't think this is, necessarily, out of control or anything like that, but it is noticeable. If you're watching our comment sections and if you're paying attention, there's a little bit of internal squabbling that goes on about what right Georgia fans have to be optimistic about the upcoming season because, Mike Bobo this and Stacey Searles that, and not all of that criticism of those guys is unfounded and unwarranted. We've said that, but if that's the sum total of your online personality, you've probably taken it too far. So what would Nolan Smith do if he was here right now? How would he redirect all of this? I think he would grab anything at his disposal to kind of become the new version of 7-5 for the upcoming year. Now, here's the good news, that if you want to be like Nolan Smith, or if you would assume what Nolan Smith himself would do, I think we've got some evidence here, some very specific things that can be grabbed and used as sort of the new version of 7-5, the same way it existed for Georgia back in 2022. For instance, there are odds already posted for who will win the SEC in 2025. Of course, Georgia, the reigning SEC champion. And when you look at the odds posted, I'm going to show you this courtesy of our friends over at FanDuel. You see that the favorite to win the SEC next year is Texas. They are at plus 210. That's essentially just a little bit more than 2-1. Georgia's at plus 390. That's just a little bit less than 4-1. So Texas, good bit larger of a favorite to win the SEC than Georgia. Georgia then well ahead of the likes of like Bama and Tennessee, both 7-1. LSU, Ole Miss, both 10-1. We're going to do more on some of these other SEC odds later on in the week. But the idea that Georgia is less of a favorite to win the SEC than Texas, to me, there is fodder there for that to sort of be the new 7-5, because I don't know if you know this, perhaps you have, maybe you've heard me mention it. Georgia actually beat Texas twice in 2024. And yet, despite the fact that Georgia took a game from him in Austin, took a game from him in Atlanta, despite that fact, you'd be hard-pressed to see any tangible evidence that anybody outside DawgNation is giving Georgia credit for those wins at all. Texas will be ranked higher than Georgia to begin this season. They have better odds to win the SEC. Almost inexplicably, they finished ranked higher than Georgia to end last season, once again, despite the fact that Georgia beat them twice. And y'all, this is the sort of thing that Georgia has had a lot of fun with in the past. That Nolan Smith, we're enjoying Nolan right now because he's a Super Bowl champion, but this is the sort of thing that when Nolan was at Georgia, man, he would have ate this up. He would have had such a good time with the fact that no matter how many times Georgia beats Texas, Georgia can't seem to get any credit for doing so and cannot seem to be treated as if they're on the same plane as Texas, this unbelievable powerhouse, no matter how many times they may seem to lose to the Dogs in the process. I think this is a perfect rallying cry for Georgia during this offseason at a time in which we kind of need it, because there is a little bit of infighting about among Georgia fans about what should happen next and who's to blame for why Georgia came up short this year and all that kind of stuff. Instead of the internal squabble of Georgia fan versus Georgia fan over what needs to be fixed with the program, how about pointing some of that energy outside the program, paying attention to the media types who can't seem to give Georgia credit for what it did against the Longhorns? I think that's really fun. Now, we've said before that eventually at some point in time this offseason, and our buddy $1 Million Eddie on the desk is going to help us do this here, we're going to try to do some stuff to help people remember the fact that, oh, yeah, Georgia did get a couple of wins against Texas. We're going to do some stuff, try to help people remember that at a certain point. We'll get there eventually. But for now, in the days after we've just watched Nolan Smith help lead the Philadelphia Eagles to a Super Bowl, let's reflect on what Nolan would do if he was still in Athens. He would be chewing all of this up. The fact that the pollsters and the odds makers and the media types, the fact that everybody seems to be in love with Texas despite the fact that Georgia beat them twice, you better believe that would be the kind of thing that Nolan Smith would be using as fodder for motivation for Georgia going into 2025. And these Dogs this season would do well to steal that page from Nolan's playbook. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by ServPro. We are so glad you're with us. You watch us live on video at 10 a.m. Most of you watch on video after the fact, just like you would kind of use it as a podcast. Speaking of podcasts, we're out there for you. Apple Player, Spotify, of course, radio, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. The thing we've done, and we've been doing this now going on 10 years, is trying to put the show out in as many platforms as we can to sort of be convenient for you in a time that works for you, on a platform that works for you. We do our best to be as accessible for you as we possibly can. And the fact that you've shown up for as long as you have, we are just so, so grateful for that. And we are so thankful to friends like ServPro who make today's show possible. Studio like this, opportunities to speak to you like we have. If it wasn't for great sponsors, we would not be able to do that. And ServPro is certainly among the best. And they can do great work for you. Let's face it, if you find yourself in a messy situation, because sometimes a fire might break out in your home or your business or wherever else. You may have a roof collapse, or a pipe may burst, or a burst? Grammar, not my strong suit. You may have an issue like that. Basement floods. Goodness knows that happens all the time. We're going to have a lot of rain the next couple of days. Some people will be dealing with that sort of thing. Well, if your mess is messy enough and if your anxiety about that is high enough, just please understand something. You can have it all put back together and cleaned up and have it looking like it never even happened. That's what the restoration specialists of ServPro are all about. They've really kind of made a brand for themselves and a name for themselves, stepping into people's messy situations, fire damage, water intrusion, things of that nature, getting it all cleaned back up for you like it never even happened. They've done that for DawgNation. They can do that for you. So I want you to find them online, servpro.com, S-E-R-V, servpro.com. One more time, that's S-E-R-V, servpro.com. The restoration specialist of ServPro, standing by, ready to do good work for you. Don't forget, each ServPro franchise, independently owned and operated. All right, we've got Jake Fromm here coming up before we're done. Great conversation with him. It's also Connor Riley here coming up in just a couple of minutes. Prior to that, though, I want to go around the doghouse. And look, we just talked about Nolan a little bit and the role that he played in helping the Eagles win the Super Bowl. And obviously a lot of Georgia fans have had a lot of fun kind of inserting themselves into this story and kind of adopting Philadelphia as our team in many cases, because they're like 6 Georgia Bulldogs who got Super Bowl rings because of the success of the Eagles. I think it's also important to note, though, that this isn't just a thing that we have done to latch on to the Philadelphia Eagles. even in the aftermath of their own Super Bowl, when they have a right, you've heard the phrase before, that winners write the history. They have a right to tell their story however they want to. And as the Eagles organization tells its story, they are more than happy to make the Georgia influence. We heard that from Jalen Hurts yesterday. They are more than happy to make the Georgia influence a very sizable part of the story that they're telling. This was shared with me, and some of y'all are very nice to do this because, honestly, I try to scour the internet and see as much as I possibly can. I don't see everything. I miss certain things I'd love to have on the show, and it's kind of funny. Some of you who've been with us for a while, you have a little bit of an idea of what sort of fits for the show, and so you're sharing this. This was shared with me. Jay Bird, I guess, had it eventually on X. It was shared with me by our buddy Army Dog Charlie, who obviously we're big fans of, a longtime part of our audience out there, of Eagles owner Jeffrey Lurie. And as Jeffrey Lurie, as all owners love to do, presented with the Lombardi Trophy, as Jeff Lurie spoke about kind of what was the story for Philadelphia this season, he also, at least it certainly sounds this way, more than happy to make the Georgia connection here a big part of this story too, that even in Philly, they know all about these Philly Dawgs. This is the Eagles owner, Jeffrey Lurie, upon receiving the Lombardi Trophy from Sunday night. Take a listen to this.
Eagles family, incredible, talented players that happen to be unselfish and humble every single day of the year. A credit to our coaching staff led by Nick, Howie and his staff, unbelievable. And by the way, about 200 other people that are the support staff that you'll never hear about, and a few dogs too.
Do you love that at the end from Jeffrey Lurie? Oh, yeah, a few dogs here, too. Don't you love that? You love the connection, the shout out there to Georgia. I think that's really incredible to hear from Mr. Lurie on that. I think it really kind of reemphasized what we've said over and over, which is this is a real thing. This is not just a coincidence that all these former Georgia players have shown up at Philadelphia. This was an intentional act on their GM, Howie Roseman's part, to get as many dogs into the building as he could get. It has clearly worked because the intangible quality those players brought during their time at Georgia, we just gave some examples of that with Nolan, they are now giving to the Eagles. I think you love that. I'm going to come back to more of that in a second. It's also the other part of this that Lurie brings up, and I'm going to talk to Jake Fromm more about this later on the show. But he says, hey, this team is made up of players who are, to use his words, as the owner of the team, incredibly talented, who also happen to be humble, who also happen to be unselfish. Boy, what a magical combination that is. And what a powerful recipe we would seem to think that was for Georgia when it was winning championships in 2021 and 2022. And if we're being honest, and sometimes our perception is wrong, I think some of us have an intuition, though, that maybe we're kind of onto something here. For whatever reason, that sort of special mix of humble, unselfish talent maybe didn't quite show up at Georgia in the same dosage that it's shown up at Georgia in the past. And listen, we're wrong frequently. Maybe we're wrong about this. But don't you kind of get that vibe a little bit? Just maybe that wasn't quite the case for this Georgia team here this year. I don't know how you go back and get that back. I don't know how you go back and replicate that. Obviously, it's not easy to do. Otherwise, more teams would do it. But it does seem to be sort of a special quotient within championship teams more often than not, it would certainly seem. And Philadelphia seemed to have that this year. The former Georgia players seemed to help provide that the same way they embodied that while they were at Georgia. You can't help but notice. However, let me also just say this real quick, and then I'm going to bring on Connor Riley. Here is the other thing that I've sort of noticed about the win that Philadelphia got and the role the former Georgia players had in helping to kind of conjure up that win. I think it's sort of made it a little more okay down here in Georgia to talk about what our local NFL team has done or perhaps oftentimes hasn't done when it's come to the former Georgia Bulldog players in the NFL draft. for instance, are you familiar with like what the Overton window is? That's kind of a thing that you sometimes hear in regular news. It's sort of the parameters of what sort of is and isn't acceptable topics for speech in polite society. At one point in time, I would say, going back, years ago, saying that the Falcons didn't draft enough Georgia players was sort of outside the sort of Overton window boundary of what was acceptable in polite society. It was kind of thought of, and I'm just being honest here, sort of a low status opinion, and like gatekeepers of what's acceptable takes, what's acceptable opinion, would have scoffed at the notion that the Falcons are supposed to draft more Georgia players just because that's the home state team. Perhaps you heard some of that scoffing or read some of that scoffing from time to time. It wasn't really acceptable to expect Atlanta to draft more Georgia players simply because Georgia was successful and it was also close by. That wasn't really acceptable. That wasn't really within the boundaries of polite society accepted conversation. But do you notice the vibe shift? It sort of seems like we're getting a little bit more of a vibe shift on that, where it's now kind of okay to say that a little bit more. I couldn't help but notice, and this is not necessarily about Georgia, but former Falcon wide receiver Roddy White was on X on Sunday. And Roddy's a little bit of a loose cannon on social media and probably in real life too. But on X, he put, the Eagles draft real football players. Like, isn't that just great? Doesn't that just sort of sum up the whole thing? Just about as well as anything. They're great on both lines of scrimmage, terrific defensively, really good running game, quarterback who sort of seems to keep his wits about him. Certainly not the embarrassment that what's his face became in Atlanta this year with the injury situation and whatever else. The Eagles just seem to be a real football team, staffed and stocked with real football players, and a lot of those players just so happen to play right down the road from Atlanta at the University of Georgia. It seems like it's sort of getting more okay to talk about this and a little bit more okay to sort of ask of Atlanta, how come you haven't had more Georgia players around over the years? And that is Around the Doghouse here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. We got Jake Fromm before we're done today. That's a lot of fun. Also, just kind of talk about the media there a little bit. There is one admission I must make about maybe something the media sort of gotten right a little bit lately. We need to pay attention to that perhaps. But for now, everything on Georgia, including the aftermath of the Super Bowl. Let's bring on Connor Riley here today, DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let me ask Connor Riley about this. He's a serious sports writer. He's a respected journalist. Years ago, it was not a high-status opinion to say that the Falcons should draft more Georgia players. I get the sense there's a vibe shift on that because Philadelphia has had the success that it's had and Georgia players were intentionally pursued by the Eagles, I feel like the Overton window is sort of shifting here a little bit, and it now is more acceptable in kind of a sort of at face value, conversation to maybe wonder, should Atlanta have more Georgia players on its roster? I think it's getting more okay to ask that question. What do you think?
Yeah, I certainly think so, especially when you factor in that the Falcons haven't had a real pass rush in, 15 years since Jonathan Abraham was last year. And you see what Nolan Smith, Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis have brought to that team. I think it's easy to make that connection, and especially going into this 2025 NFL draft where the Falcons are picking at 15, Jalen Walker could very well be there. Michael Williams could very well be there. And we've seen in the past that this Atlanta Falcons organization, while they've taken some Georgia players, they've all been in the 6th round at the back end of the draft. And at the top of the draft, they've passed on a guy like a Jordan Davis. They've passed on a guy like a Jalen Carter. Nolan Smith, I think you can include in there as well. And they've done so to add, offensive weapons that are nice to have and make a difference. But at the same point in time, I don't necessarily know that adding a first-round running back, adding a first-round wide receiver translates to winning games the same way consistently building through the offensive and defensive lines does. And so Georgia, who puts out a ton of offensive linemen and puts out a ton of defensive linemen, has helped the Philadelphia Eagles in particular. The Green Bay Packers, another successful organization, have shown that they are willing to draft Georgia players year in, year out. And so it certainly makes you wonder for an Atlanta franchise that hasn't been to the playoffs since 2017. Maybe as Georgia has gotten up and running and they're consistently putting out elite defensive prospects in particular, maybe the Falcons, it's time for them to leaning a little bit more into drafting players from the home state.
Yeah, there's never been a playoff game at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. I just think that's just an outrageous thing to have be said about you. On the Philly part of this, you're a much bigger NFL fan than I am. The sense that I get, though, because of what Jalen Hurts has said, we just played some stuff from Jeffrey Lurie a moment ago, obviously Howie Roseman, the GM statements in the past, that this Philly dog thing is real. And it's not just real for those of us who are trying to – and listen, it's February. I'll grab hold of anything I can get right now. I'm transparent about that. But it's not just us trying to hitch our wagon to this story. Even in the aftermath of winning a Super Bowl – the people up there are more than happy to give Georgia some of the credit for the culture that exists there. And I tell you, Connor, I find it to be remarkable. I'm very entertained by it. I'm proud of it as somebody who obviously, really loves Georgia, that this is not just a thing that a loudmouth like me would gladly embellish. This appears to be a real thing that has greatly influenced the success they've had.
Yeah, and maybe perhaps one of my favorite takeaways from this Super Bowl, none of the Philly Dawgs really had a statistically impactful game. Josh Sweat had 2.5 sacks. Milton Williams, the other defensive lineman for the Eagles, had 2 sacks in the forced fumble there. Jordan Davis, whose game at the University of Georgia was not predicated on a pass rushing ability or sacks, was the only Georgia player in the game to record a sack. And so for that to be the case, and then you go back and you watch this game, it's Jalen Carter just beating Patrick Mahomes to heck. It's Nolan Smith just obliterating a pulling guard. Those sort of little things showing up. It's a big reason why the Eagles had the season that they had. And I think it speaks to the culture that they've helped build off of in their time at obviously the University of Georgia, but now with the Philadelphia Eagles, because, when they drafted Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith in the 2023 NFL draft, the Eagles were coming off a Super Bowl appearance. And the biggest difference in this game from where they lost to the Chiefs 2 years ago to where they won this time around, at least in the confines of this game, it wasn't Saquon Barkley. It was how they were able to get after Patrick Mahomes with a front four without having to blitz, the famous stat now that they weren't blitzing at all in that game. And I think that speaks directly to what Georgia does in their defensive scheme, and then ultimately how that translates to the NFL level with Jalen Carter, who, in my opinion right now, is the best interior defensive lineman in the sport. I believe he ended up setting the NFL record for most pressures in a single postseason there. Nolan Smith, who made major strides this season, and even Nakobe Dean, an off-ball linebacker who unfortunately suffered a knee injury at the beginning of the playoffs, but he had a stellar season this year as well. And so I'm interested seeing moving forward how these guys continue to grow and how they take on even a larger role in this Philadelphia organization, because it feels like to me, these guys who are only in their second and third years respectively are just starting to scratch the surface of what they can do at the NFL level.
Here is something else that I find to be interesting about Philadelphia. They mirror to me a lot of what's currently working in college football, because we had this era for a while where it was like Trevor Lawrence and Joe Burrow, and I guess you count Mac Jones in that, where like the elite quarterback was leading a team to a national championship. Connor, we have not had that in a few years. Bryce Young was a great player but did not win a national championship. Will Howard for Ohio State this year, that's not a great quarterback. I think he played very well in the playoff. That's not a great quarterback. McCarthy for Michigan was a first-round, pick, but that was not the main reason that Michigan won the national championship in 2023. That there's an element of what the Eagles are, great on defense, really good at the running game, pretty balanced offense and defense. Jalen Hurts, who certainly playing well is important for him, and he clearly was Super Bowl MVP, obviously, on Sunday. But this is not Jalen Hurts and the Philadelphia Eagles. This is Jalen Hurts and the Philadelphia Eagles. And to me, college football, including Georgia, by the way, especially when Georgia's at its best, sort of looks like that. Do you get the point that I'm making here?
Yeah, and I know you make this point as well. It's not like the Eagles won with subpar quarterback play, just like Ohio State, Georgia, Michigan won with subpar quarterback play. But they're not winning with their quarterback, A, being the best player on their team, or B, being the most expensive, or the way they build the whole team around them. You look at, say, the Cincinnati Bengals and what they're sort of floundering through right now and how they're opting to build their team in juxtaposition to what Jalen Hurts and the Eagles have done in recent seasons here as well. And again, it's just an important reminder. And it's something you and I, we talked about back in August with the flaws, I think, of this 2024 Georgia team that played out over the course of the season. And this might come off as a shot at Carson Beck. It's not. They put too much on the shoulders of Carson Beck. And I don't put that at necessarily at Carson's feet. I think I put some of that at Kirby's feet as well in terms of roster building, in terms of bringing in talent and having guys around him. Because as well as Jalen Hurts has played, it helps a lot to have guys like A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith at wide receiver. Georgia didn't have college football equivalents of that this past season. And I think with what you saw from Hurts, who was outstanding, in my opinion, in the Super Bowl on Sunday, yeah, it helps to have a guy that, when absolutely called upon, can make the plays. But to get to that championship setting where it allows guys like Jalen Hurts or in the past Stetson Bennett to shine, you need to have other talented players on your roster that are making things easy for that quarterback over the course of a long season.
So do you think, and once again, this sort of turns into the blame Carson thing, and I really don't want to do that because I don't believe Carson Beck was the sole reason that Georgia had team chemistry issues this past season. Just being completely honest, I don't think he was the sole reason. But now that Georgia this year, we presume, is going to have a little bit more of a Jalen Hurts style quarterback, a quarterback that's sort of more on par with the other players. Do you think that team chemistry is going to be easier for Georgia to establish, maybe the way that it was for a team like Ohio State this past season?
I think it is for a couple of different reasons. And you and I were texting about this over the weekend. I think the COVID class and the COVID extra year that was provided from 2020 and sort of exempting players an extra year, it sort of spread out the roster a little bit where you had this past season, sort of three different classes that could say, hey, we're seniors. Xavier Truss famously participated in senior day 3 times at the University of Georgia. I think this year the leadership, I think this year the leadership is going to be a little bit more centralized. And I think that's going to help this team be a little bit more connected. Arian Smith obviously gave some very big quotes to the Athletic down at the Senior Bowl there. And I think that those comments, and I encourage you to go read them, I think are very illuminating on part of, the little things that Georgia didn't do well this past season. Because the reason they weren't this vintage Georgia team like we saw in 21 or 2022, a lot of it was little stuff. They didn't tackle as well. They didn't catch the football quite as well. And it's things like that where, so many people may roll their eyes about talking about connection and playing for a brotherhood and things like that. But I think that's where that really shows up. And so for Georgia to regress in those areas this past season, I do think explains why maybe this team in 2024 wasn't as connected, wasn't as tight. And so moving into 2025, I think the seniors on this team understand that very well. They were freshmen on that 2022 national championship team. They sort of know that, hey, we're going to have to come together in a way that maybe this past team didn't for a variety of reasons. And I think because of that, it might help them a little bit more, that it is a little bit more of a centralized leadership position, whereas you have this past year guys from the 2019, 2020, and 2021 sort of all falling into that senior bucket class. There's one 2021 recruit still left on this roster. That's Micah Morris. And then you've got 12 players from the 2022 class that make up sort of your traditional senior class.
If you want more of Connor Riley, you get the DawgNation newsletter. We call it our Hunker Download. You can get it by signing up at DawgNation.com/newsletter. It's the best of DawgNation delivered right to your inbox each and every day, including this time of year right now, too, kind of pre-spring practice, looking at everything happening around the Georgia Bulldogs. The DawgNation newsletter, we call it the Hunker Download. It's DawgNation.com/newsletter. You can sign up and have it delivered right to you. I think you'll really, really enjoy it. Connor, last topic I want to hit with you just for a second here, and we kind of talked about this a little bit off the top of the program. I think this is really fun. That there probably is a little bit of like restless infighting among some Georgia fans right now. And listen, that's just par for the course in college football. It's not a scandal. It's just the way things work. College football fans, obviously very, very high strung. I probably am right there, with you when it comes to stuff like that. But it's nice to have sort of an external enemy to kind of take some of the infighting and kind of point it towards something outside the fan base. And I do think some of this Texas stuff gives you a chance for that. The fact that Texas was ranked higher than Georgia to finish the season, despite the fact that Georgia beat them twice. Texas almost certainly will be ranked higher than Georgia in the preseason polls later on this summer. And as we kind of showed on video a little earlier, Texas is also favored over Georgia, according to FanDuel, to win the SEC this year in 2025, despite the fact that Georgia is the reigning champ. Now, listen, I think Texas does have a lot going for it. I'm not here to lie and, sort of make up something that isn't true. But at the same time, the fact that Georgia seemingly continually gets no credit for beating Texas in Austin and beating them again in Atlanta, honestly, that's sort of, to me, the kind of spot where Georgia fans are pretty comfortable. They like the idea of, all of a sudden, we're not getting any credit for this at all and getting a little ornery about that. That feels like a pretty comfortable spot for this fan base to be, and I do think that could be the rallying cry for the offseason.
You and I are in agreement on this, and I'd be curious for your opinion of it. How much of this Texas love, especially now as we transition away from 2024 and into 2025, is tied to Arch Manning and his presumed starting impact and him being the starting quarterback for the University of Texas in 2025? How much of that do you think influences the way that people are viewing this Texas team?
We're getting a little bit of a bleed into our video feed, Jay, if you hear that. I think the Arch Manning stuff does play into this, but I also think there's something fair here, too, and that Texas is the only team to be in the Final Four the last 2 years. So, this is a team with some tangible accomplishment, but there's no doubt that Arch Manning is and we've done this in the show a few days ago, there's no doubt that Arch Manning is about to be sort of a special level of famous, here for this program. There's no doubt that's about to happen. So I think that does add to it a little bit. But we can't say that Texas hasn't accomplished anything. They won a couple of playoff games this year. They were in the Final Four a year ago. That Steve Sarkisian is building something. We just don't know how high that edifice is going to go.
Yeah, and I think to that point as well, Texas hasn't won a national championship since 2005, whereas Georgia, they've won 2 in recent memory. And so the fact that Texas can be viewed as a program on the upswing and they've got a very famous quarterback there, I think that just naturally attracts a lot of casual, both college football fans, but even casual media observers as well, to just want to hitch the ride to this wagon that is Texas in 2025. Whereas Georgia, I think that there are people out there wondering, has the game passed Kirby Smart by? Is he struggling with the transfer portal? They can't land a receiver, it so seems. And so it just makes it easy for some media observers to sort of latch on to Texas as an accomplished program, as you point out, but something that is still somewhat new and somewhat fresh. Add in Arch Manning to that, and I think you see why a lot of casual media people in the sport are just sort of penciling in Texas where maybe they necessarily shouldn't, over a Georgia program that has proven on the football field that it is just better than Texas right now.
Connor, always love the conversation. Great stuff. We'll read you more at DawgNation.com. We'll look forward to speaking to you soon right back here on DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro.
Yep, as always, it's a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
I've got another point I want to make about that here in a moment, fair and balanced, that I think has to be said. But prior to that, let's go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Let's get excited about some awesome stuff with Royal Caribbean here in the brand new year. It's really time to, if you think about summer cruises, things like that, it's really time to go ahead and get that locked in. Jessica Slater, a travel agent, she doesn't work with Royal Caribbean. She works for, I should say, let me reverse that. She doesn't work for Royal Caribbean. She works with Royal Caribbean. They really believe that a great Royal Caribbean cruise vacation made even better when you use a terrific travel agent to help you plan it. That's what Jessica is able to do for you, whether it's Icon of the Seas sailing out of Miami, or how about, Utopia of the Seas sailing out of Port Canaveral, all the great specialty restaurant concepts like Giovanni's Table and all the really cool stuff there. If you want to know the options that are available to you, the cool stuff that each ship has, Jessica can tell you all about that. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email Jessica, jslater@dreamvacations.com. One more time, that's jslater@dreamvacations.com. She can help you plan a great Royal Caribbean cruise vacation here in 2025. All right, I'm going to make one point here, cruise around the SEC, and then we'll bring on Jake Fromm here in just a moment. So just talking to Connor about this, we talked about this off the top of the program. The hype that Texas is going to receive. And some of that does kind of make you roll your eyes just a little bit. It's a little bit annoying. However, here's the one thing we do have to be honest about. When it comes to the most hyped team in the offseason, I hate to say this. It pains me to admit this. But the most hyped team in the offseason has actually won the national championship 2 years in a row. And if you want to go back to, like, say, the 2023 offseason leading into Michigan's championship, y'all, we made fun of that the entire summer. We would drag out every ESPN talking head and everybody else. It was sort of hyping up the Wolverines, and we just laughed in their face because we really thought that Georgia was going to go for 3 in 23. Perhaps you remember that. And we had good reason to feel that way. But the people who were hyping up Michigan during that offseason, in some cases outright predicting them to win the national championship, they kind of got it right. I mean, you have to admit that. Ohio State this past offseason. You know, Ohio State took a dip in its attention during the year, especially after it lost to Michigan to conclude the regular season. But once again, go back to the offseason. Undoubtedly the most talked about team in that offseason, Ohio State did go on to win the national championship. So once again, we're kind of in a spot where we may roll our eyes at some of what we're about to hear about Texas. And we do legitimately believe that Georgia has not gotten enough credit for its 2 wins against the Longhorns this past season. That's all true. But you can't help but notice that some of this media hype over the course of the last couple of years has turned out not to be completely unfounded, that it has been a precursor to a national championship. Just sort of fair to point out that the media, when it comes to the team it's chosen to hype during the offseason, the last couple of years has kind of gotten some of that kind of stuff right. What does that mean for Texas this year? We will obviously wait and see. Let's also go ahead and bring our music down. I had another story I was going to do. The Auburn defensive coordinator, DJ Durkin, gets a big raise. We'll save that. We'll talk more about that later on. For now, let's kind of shift away here and get ready to go to a Kroger Fresh Take and bring on Jake Fromm here today on DawgNation Daily. Always happy to have Jake as a part of the program. Jake, welcome in. Glad to have you here as a part of a Kroger Fresh Take here today.
Always glad to be here, Brandon. Thank you for having me.
I see the nice little man cave or office look there for you. Got a couple jerseys framed behind you. Are you a...
We're working on it a little bit.
Yeah,
we got
good.
a ways to go, but working.
Are you a collector? Do you have a lot of your stuff over the years?
I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a collector at all by any means, but I am somewhat of a hoarder.
Okay.
And keeping junk, keeping jerseys, and that kind of thing. So I definitely have a lot of them. Need a lot of them framed, especially a lot kind of from the league and swapping jerseys with guys. So there's a lot to hang on the walls, and glad I got a lot of wall space.
Yeah, if you don't mind, because I am a collector. I like, my son and I, we like baseball cards, things like that.
Yeah.
If I was I collect a lot of stuff from my media. Well, like I can only imagine what I'd be doing if I was actually an athlete. I mean, when you leave Georgia or the NFL, teams that you played on, like how much and this is a personal question, I guess, but like how much of your own stuff can you keep? Like if you said to the New York Giants, hey, can I keep my jersey? Are they going to say yes? Or if you say to Georgia, can I keep my helmet? As a player, are you allowed to keep your stuff?
Yeah, so great question. At the end of every season, usually teams will let you have one jersey, and then you can buy multiple other jerseys. And it's kind of it's a one-time deal, once in a lifetime thing. It's kind of, hey, whatever it costs, hey, I'm gonna buy it, right? You can't go get a game like jersey just off the street. So yeah, I'm gonna buy kind of my jersey in all the different colors. I'm gonna grab my helmet as well. You do have to buy it. And the stuff's not cheap, but it's kind of a once in a lifetime deal. Hey, I'm going to buy it. So I got, all my helmets from all the teams I've been on, and I'm going back to the Lions next year, but I still have, I still bought both helmets and got all 3 jerseys. Cause I don't know, man, it's just something special about it. You can never go back and get it again. And you never know who may want it one day. And I don't know what you can do with it.
Yeah, it's one of those things, and we'll shift gears and talk about something different here in a moment. It's one of those things where, like, when you're in the midst of a football career, it's just your life. You don't think that much about it.
Yeah.
But when you pull back, you realize, oh, like 1 in every 10,000 guys gets to play college football. A smaller percentage than that get to play in the NFL. That if you are lucky enough to suit up, whether it be SEC football, NFL football, you are achieving kind of a football moment that most people, I mean, like the overwhelming majority of people could only dream of. Having something to remember that time, I'm talking about when you look back on it years later, that's
100%.
obviously an appropriate thing to do.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, it is a blessing to play this game, and sometimes when you're in the middle of it, like you said, you don't really appreciate it or think about it. But definitely years down the road, you can look back and appreciate it a lot more. Kind of spark some memories, spark some conversation, and have some maybe good fire talks, with it as well.
What did you think about the Super Bowl?
The fellowship we had here at our party at our house was great. Great conversation. Food, I think, was pretty good. I was in charge of the food, so I think it was pretty good. But no, there wasn't much watching the game. There wasn't a whole lot going on. It's pretty one-sided. Good to see all those Dogs there in Philly, get a Super Bowl on top of their national championship ring. So happy for those guys, man. They deserve it. They are a hard-working, very talented bunch who just knows how to win, and they just figure it out wherever they go.
Yeah, I talked about this a little bit yesterday. I'm older than you are. When I was growing up, every Super Bowl was a blowout. From the time I was first old enough to remember all the way almost through high school. Super Bowl, for whatever reason, was a blowout every year. Now, in recent years, we've had some really good games. Almost all the best Super Bowls from, excitement and closeness of game, things like that. Almost all of them have been in recent years. The game we had Sunday is sort of like the Super Bowl that I grew up with. And, if we had better Super Bowls back then, maybe I'd be a bigger NFL fan now than I am. But, I mean, whether it be, New York Giants a couple times, Washington, Chicago Bears, obviously the 49ers. Growing up, it was all blowouts, kind of like that.
Yeah, and it's so weird with a league with so much parity. Two of your best teams playing in the biggest game, you would think that they would all come down to the wire. But man, it's weird the way it happens. I guess kind of probably something with the 2-week break and kind of all the magnitude and the focus that kind of comes with it. I don't know. It's just very interesting to see. We definitely got the good end of the stick last year with the Chiefs and the 49ers. My good buddy Charlie Warner playing in that game, obviously losing and coming up a little short, but that was a great game last year. And, man, this year just wasn't quite it, unless, of course, you were a Philly fan and then you loved every single bit of it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Something else we've talked about a little bit. We played a clip earlier of Jeffrey Lurie, the Eagles owner, and one of the things he said about his team was, hey, this is an incredibly talented team, and we certainly don't dispute that. Talented players, of course, on both sides of the ball. He also said that they're unselfish and they're humble. And this is a serious question. How do you cultivate that kind of unselfishness and humility in a locker room when guys are playing for their own personal ambitions? There's money on the line. It's a salary cap league. If it means if I get money, that's money you can't have because it is a hard cap league. How do you cultivate that unselfishness and that humility? Because honestly, it does seem like whichever team that wins seems to have a heavier dose of that than sometimes some of the teams that end up coming up a little bit short.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a lot about your personnel department. It's the guys that you're bringing in there into the locker room, right? There's talented guys everywhere across the league. You see them, every Sunday doing all kinds of things. But are you bringing the right guys in to your locker room, made of the right stuff? Guys who know how to win, who are unselfish. I know it's so much easier said than done, but if you can never find what that scouting niche is, whatever that little detail is to give you an insight, man, if you squeeze this person and you put them through the fire and you test them, what's going to come out? That obviously is something they figured out there at Philly, and they've done a great job of winning because of that. And I don't think there's any coincidence that there's a lot of dogs up there in Philly, and they're a successful franchise.
It's our Kroger Fresh Take with Jake Fromm here today on DawgNation Daily. Don't forget, we got Valentine's coming up at the end of the week. Great time for you to go to your local Kroger and get, whether it be the greeting cards, the gift cards, the flowers, the stuff for a meal if you're going to sort of cook it yourself there. All kinds of stuff right there at your local Kroger. And if you want it delivered right to you, make Valentine's even more fun and more convenient. You can become a Kroger Boost member and get a chance to enjoy that too. Kroger.com/boost. You can try for free for 30 days, earn twice the fuel points on the things you're already buying at your local Kroger, and just really make a great Valentine's time of year here this week with everything right there at your local Kroger. So shop in store or online, Kroger.com, and give Kroger Boost a try and enjoy that membership opportunity. So, Jake, to finish things off here, to kind of keep that same conversation going, what role do you think the quarterback plays in cultivating that? Because to me, what's interesting about Philadelphia is Jalen Hurts is obviously a very good quarterback. He's Super Bowl MVP, but he's not the kind of, I guess, biggest salary in the NFL, personality that sort of exists on a higher plane than guys like Jalen Carter or Saquon Barkley. It seems like he's sort of a part of the team as opposed to the main focus of the team with everybody else kind of in the background. Obviously for Georgia here this year, they want to try to get some of that, selfless humility back the same way those former Georgia guys kind of defined their times at Georgia that way. Whether it be Gunner or a different quarterback for a different team, what role does quarterback play in creating the sort of culture that the Eagles seem to have?
Yeah, a huge one. I think it kind of starts with that guy there in that QB room, how he is in the locker room, how he walks around the building, conducts himself, how he treats his teammates. Do you treat the teammate at the lower end of the roster in the depth chart the same as you treat the receiver catching all of your passes, of the left tackle, who's all pro or all American, or do you treat everybody the same? I think it makes a huge difference of what that guy is made out of, because stuff is going to hit the fan during the season. And man, you want that guy to respond the right way, not point fingers, but man, kind of look at himself. Hey, how can I get better? How can I treat my teammates better, and how can I go out and figure out how to win a football game? So I think it makes an absolutely huge difference for who that guy is and what he's made out of.
Jake, home looks great. Always a pleasure to get a chance to speak to you as a part of our Kroger Fresh Take. We really appreciate that. Hope you have a great week, and we will look forward to our chance to hopefully speak to you again very soon as well.
Thank you, Brandon. See you next week. Good
stuff there from Jake Fromm as part of a Kroger Fresh Take. I talk about this a lot. Sometimes we kind of turn to speak to a guest. I'm sort of moving around. I have a hard time being still anyway. Have a tendency to get a little tangled up in wires. Let me tell you something. In the history of this show, I have never been more tangled up in wires than I am right now. I'm going to have to stay it up in a minute to get untangled here. But nonetheless, great stuff from Jake Fromm. By the way, speaking of great stuff, many of you made this a big part of your big football weekend this past weekend as you start to look ahead to all the fun stuff going to be going on this spring. You're going to be loving the Finish Long Drink. And if you haven't tried this yet, it's a great time to do that. In fact, if you go to thelongdrink.com, you can learn more about the store here. This is a delicious beverage, kind of a special category of beverage. We call it a ready-to-drink cocktail. That means if you like mixed drinks, this is a mixed drink in a can. You don't have to mix yourself. Going back to the 1950s, this was made in celebration of the Summer Games being in Helsinki. Then, within the last, 10 years or so, a little bit less than that, it's been here in America. It's made its way to Georgia. Our friends at the Finish Long Drink have been a big part of DawgNation Daily for a long time now. And we've loved helping tell the story of the Finish Long Drink and watching its growth here in our state because of that. So go to thelongdrink.com. You can learn about all the varieties, the peach-flavored version, the traditional citrus, the blue can, the grapefruit flavor, the gin kick, Long Drink Strong. That's the black can. Long Drink Zero, no carbs, no sugar. That's an awesome option for you. Just make sure you try some Finish Long Drink today online, thelongdrink.com, for a lot more on that. So obviously there's still a lot of fun and celebration taking place about these Philly Dawgs having won the Super Bowl, and this is happening in all corners of sports and entertainment here right now. In fact, last night on Netflix, WWE Raw, about the return of course, a big Georgia fan, AJ Styles, back last night on Monday Night Raw. And they do this thing now where, they show the wrestlers coming into the arena. They were at Bridgestone Arena in Nashville last night. They show the wrestlers coming into the arena. And AJ Styles, it's a little bit hard to tell this from my screenshot, but he's wearing a Philly Dawgs hat. It's basically a combination of the Georgia logo, the Philly logo kind of combined together. AJ Styles wearing that last night as he returned to Raw. Obviously a big Georgia fan, and many of you know I actually went to high school with AJ. Very, very proud of the success that he's having and has had in a great career. Getting ready for the road to WrestleMania there, so we'll give AJ Styles a golden shoe for that. Lousy, stinking Gators, we will give them nothing but more misery. It's been 1,557 days since Florida has beaten Georgia. We love that number to keep on climbing. Never been higher, at least in a long time, than it will be by the time these two teams meet again. So that's really exciting. Our buddy $1 Million Eddie loves every bit of that. And we'll obviously see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by ServPro. Have a great day, everybody. And on video, time now for our RS Andrews Cool Down. RS Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. You can depend on that from them here today. Now, I told you, I'm not even kidding. I'm going to have to stand up or something. I've got computer charger. I've got hardline network here. My can we see if we can get this all squared away here? This is a mess. How did I get so tangled up? What a disaster this is. I might just take my headphones off. That may make it better. What a disaster that was. I'm all tangled up in everything here. Like we do this all the time. I've never been more tangled up than I am right now. So we'll get more of your comments here. We'll have a fun time as part of our RS Andrews Cool Down, and we'll see what everybody's got going on. I'll go to DawgNation.com here for a moment, find out what people are doing over there. UJ Marine, by the way, lives in Texas. He says he's going to be there tonight at College Station for the big one for Georgia against Texas A&M. Georgia's got to find a handful of wins somewhere. We'll see if they're able to do that tonight against Texas A&M. But UJ Marine, you enjoy the game. We'll look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow to tell us more about it. And hopefully we'll have some good news to celebrate. Garrison Tucker says, will you do any fishing this spring? Says got white bass coming up the Oconee soon. Yeah, I hope to be able to do a lot of that. My son and I like to stick out there and do that every now and then. Like outdoor stuff does not really come all that natural to me. My son was sort of born with a little bit of a outdoorsman vibe. It's kind of amazing how, sometimes kids are just different than their parents. My son has always been into that sort of thing. So we'd like to get out there and do a little bit of that kind of stuff, although I am by no means an expert necessarily. UJ Marine also celebrating Trey Phelps, Colton Smith, kind of getting some early love here, Golden Spikes watch list and stuff like that. Yeah, Diamond Dogs this weekend begin what could be a really fun season for them. Let us see what else. A lot of fun stuff over here at DawgNation.com. Let me get some YouTube stuff here for a minute, too. Let's see how they are doing. Over here at DawgNation.com. Kirby's Belt says that I got a haircut. I did not get a haircut. What happens is I'm going to have to do something. Sorry about that, y'all. Just somehow all my cord just got wrapped all the way around my chair. I did not get a haircut. I took my headphones off because I was so tangled up over here a little earlier that I just look a little different than I normally do. Jonathan Aaron says, who won the cruise? I have not heard that. We'll see if we can announce that here pretty soon. I have not heard who won the cruise. That's a great question. We need to announce that. We need to announce that. I have not heard. Greg Hendricks says it's snowing up in Lexington, Kentucky right now. So, first of all, Greg, we appreciate you checking in. Still a lot of winter up there. I think it's supposed to rain a bunch here the next couple of days. Johnny Surf Dog says, fly high, Philly Dawgs. Yeah, you love all of that. Wyatt Fielding says that Georgia's been picked in one of the preseason rankings to win the SEC this year from 11.7 website. get to Foley Field this year. Wes Johnson said last night this team was built differently and fun. Yeah, like the one thing that a lot of these people have been saying is really a lot of love for like the transfer class they brought in. Like the one thing that Wes Johnson's sort of most known for, I was gonna put my headphones back on, but I can't even get to them. One of the things that Wes Johnson's sort of known for, obviously being a great pitching coach throughout the years. So I think you would presume that pitching sort of takes the next step for him. Same issue that you're going to have with basketball in some respects is that Georgia's going to be very good, but it's also expected to be once again a very competitive SEC. Texas A&M, they'll both be really good. Arkansas is going to be really good in baseball this year. Other usual suspects, I'm sure they'll be pretty good too. Between the depth of the SEC, ACC going to be really deep again. Clemson, Virginia, going to be a fun sport. I've grown to really love college baseball. Cousin Eddie says he's got this exact same pullover. I'll tell you this: I always get a ton of compliments when I wear this. People really, really seem to like this. Foster Moss says I'm discombobulated. Yeah, every now and then I get a little tangled up. But something happened today where all the cords started wrapping around the base of the chair, and I could not get them undone. It's like pulling me down like this, and there was just nothing I could do about it. Let's see what else. Melissa Clark on the subject of Jackson Cantwell. Yeah, that's, I would say, in the early days of the 2026 recruiting, that's one of those I'm watching, pretty closely. You would presume that NIL is going to be a big part of that recruitment. Obviously, Missouri's got the interesting NIL law in place, of course, on that. And it's also one of those things where, I don't know how many teams this offseason have made themselves dramatically better because of the transfer portal. That's one thing. But two, when you look at the offensive line and offensive tackle position in particular, like those are not guys you get in the transfer portal. Those are guys you got to get, kind of in your own sort of homegrown way here. And kind of getting back in the business of getting those elite, offensive line prospects, really, really important for Georgia. Cantwell going to be one of the biggest names for sure. Let's see what else. Lieutenant Dan says that Georgia may have lost its hunger for another championship. Yeah, I don't know. I would have my suspicions that that's true. I think that you may see kind of return to that hunger for Georgia. As we said yesterday, much like Kansas City, Georgia's attempt to win 3 straight championships is just a really hard thing to do. Never happened in the Super Bowl era for NFL, never really happened at all, in anything you'd constitute the modern era for college football. But, coming up a little bit short, no reason to think that Georgia can't get right back in pursuit of another championship again here after a couple of years of kind of just being slightly on the outside looking in on that. Greg Rosenberg says that Kirby should hire Nolan, Nakobe, JD, and JC to be assistant coaches for the spring, bringing that energy and swag to the locker room. Yeah, it's been said before that, hey, Nolan Smith wants to be the next coach at Georgia or a coach at Georgia one day. When you hear him talk, I think you're led to believe, gosh, if that really is what he wanted to do, that he really would have his chance to do that. Alan Hampton also says that by drafting Dean and Smith, the Eagles got 2 exceptional leaders and motivators. I have that same pullover as well. It's favorite. Yeah, it's really good stuff. I really do enjoy wearing this, and I like the fact that people seem to like it too. It's always nice to hear somebody say something nice. Lance D says the Falcons scout always seem to want to make a name for themselves, recommending sort of a diamond in the rough like Troy Anderson from Montana State over a proven Georgia player like Nakobe Dean. I think there's some of that. Look, ultimately, I think Atlanta just wants good players for the most part. I do think organizationally, there's perhaps not enough of a. I want to be as fair as I can possibly be. I think the Atlanta Falcons organization at times to me comes across as very proud of itself for very undefined reasons. And I don't think they like the idea of thinking they need to borrow Georgia's credibility for a popularity boost for themselves. I don't think they like the idea of that. In other words, Philadelphia seemingly had no problem saying, boy, we need as much of what Georgia has as we can get. They had no problem saying that about themselves. But Atlanta, for whatever reason, I think it actually feels – this is my suspicion. I can't prove this. And like many things, there's a very good chance I'm wrong about this. I think Atlanta thinks of itself as in competition with UGA. I do. And it's just sort of a vibe that I get that for instance, we've seen like the Braves like really embrace Georgia football. They have the Brandon Knights, they have the they have Georgia Night at the stadium, things like that. We've seen the Atlanta Braves embrace Georgia football in a way that I don't think we've seen the Atlanta Falcons. And it, in many respects, may be easier for the Braves to embrace Georgia football because there's a huge overlap between the two fan bases. The two seasons, for the most part, kind of overlap themselves, whereas the Falcons and Georgia are fighting for the same attention during the same time of year. And obviously, from a TV rating standpoint, the NFL is sort of always going to be king. They own TV ratings. But there's a lot of other ways to sort of measure success locally other than TV ratings. And I do believe that the Falcons view Georgia as a competitor for that sort of thing. That's just my suspicion. Oh, yeah, Blind Squirrel Sports mentioning that you've also got Mississippi State in that conversation for baseball this year. I think that's true. I mean, look, it's just going to be an incredibly deep year. Motivated Dedicated said, I told you that Philly by 17. He says 1 point off. You are right about that. Great call for you on that part. Greg Rosenberg says, as a football fan, Falcons and Dogs, they don't compete for my attention. If they're both good, they'll both get it from me. And I think a lot of people locally kind of feel that way. I do. I don't know that everybody feels that way, though. Allen also predicts that Georgia's going to have plenty of energy in pursuit of a championship here in 2025, and I certainly like that. Let's see what else. Lewis Southern would like the idea of DawgNation doing some ticket giveaways, some of the big games here in 2025. That would certainly be pretty fun. By the way, I've also been kind of following, for those of you who are Georgia season ticket holders, there's been a lot of chatter about some of the stuff related to Georgia tickets as of late, about, I guess excessive transfers and people using their tickets as almost like their own sort of ticket broker opportunity and selling tickets on a regular basis. I have some mixed feelings about that, to be honest with you. It's been interesting to watch that play out, but I've got some mixed feelings about that. On Facebook, Robert Evans says that Philly Dawgs giving credit to the Georgia Standard. Go Dogs. Yeah, Robert, you love that. Kevin Chapman says the Falcons are going to Falcon. Brady mentioned at halftime the 28-3 lead at the half and the loss in reference to Kansas City not being too far. Yeah, I heard that, Kevin, from Brady the other night. And what was funny is almost like the next play or something like that. I guess it was the fumble recovery from the Eagles took place on a 2nd and 26. It's like, golly, they're playing all the hits right now. 28-3, 2nd and 26, and everything else. How about this? Yolanda Brack says, I'm going to be in Athens with my granddaughter performing Saturday with Georgia's All-State Chorus. Talented young vocalists from throughout the state. Y'all come see them. Yolanda, what a cool thing. Congratulations to your granddaughter there on that. I'm sure that'll be a fantastic show, and nothing more beautiful than hearing a lot of voices coming together to sing like that. That's awesome. Clayton Davis taking it back to Hines Ward. Yeah. When you look at like Georgia players the Falcons could have drafted, Ward ends up being one of the worst because same round he was taken, drafting ahead of him, Falcons took Jamie German as a receiver, and then Ward goes on to be essentially a Hall of Famer. A couple of years prior to that, Falcons took Steve Broussard, running back, instead of Rodney Hampton. Hampton went on to a good career. So there's definitely been a lot of examples of that. William Camacho says you got to go to wireless AirPods. I will say this. Now, this is a studio setting. We're not going to do that, period. But even in kind of like the Zoom setting, you can always, I'm talking about across all kinds of content, you can always tell when people have the wireless AirPods in. It does not sound good. For whatever reason, wireless AirPods is not a great sound for the show and for interviews and things like that. You can always tell. You can always tell about that. All right, a couple of other comments. We're ready to go. Sebastian Clerk on the subject of DJ Lagway. Yeah, we expect DJ Lagway to have a really good year. I think it's going to be a really good year for SEC quarterbacks in general. We could be, a very, very deep league as it relates to that. I think one of the things, if you're going to be thinking about a big leap forward for Florida, we're going to say this about the DJ Durkin thing. So Durkin gets a big raise at Auburn. It's not obvious why they gave him this raise, to be frank. But the one thing that Auburn seems to have is, like, Durkin's a real DC. You can say what you want to. He's had some issues in the past, but he's a real DC. That's a substantial coach to have in place. Hugh Freeze, say what you want about him in the past, but he's a real offensive-minded head coach. There's some real coaches working when it comes to Auburn. Florida has a little bit of a lot of chefs in the kitchen situation going on right now, where it's kind of hard to tell exactly what Florida may have going for it in a year in which they need to sort of step up and perform better. The role that coaches will play in making that happen for Florida right now, that's wait and see for me at the moment. But I don't dispute DJ Lagway's a very good player. Mike Mazel says, go on my cruise. It'll be tangle-free there. Listen, I'm ready to be on a cruise. Last couple of years, we've done something sort of cruise-related around February. I am going to take some time off here coming up soon, but no cruise for me on that. We just moved a few months ago. Still trying to, got a lot going on with that. Kids got a bunch of stuff going on right now. Not able to kind of get that February cruise going. I really missed that in my life. Really missed that. Wish I was taking a cruise right now. Let me go back around to the different comment sections. We're going to get ready to bounce out of here after that. Greg Rosenberg mentioned another one of those big Falcons misses, taking Beasley over Todd Gurley. Just a huge, huge miss. Beasley had the one good sack here, but even in the midst of it, most of the football experts out there would have said that's not really a replicable performance from Beasley. They never came close to matching that again the rest of his career, whereas Todd Gurley for a while was arguably best offensive player in the NFC. Huge miss by the Falcons not drafting Todd Gurley, we would say. Melissa Clark, and I'm right there with you, Melissa. We do this every year. I fall into the trap every single year. Last week, including even into Super Bowl Sunday, just gorgeous, gorgeous weather here in Georgia. Just loved every minute of it, but it doesn't last. And now it's like cold and rainy again. It's like, golly. And when it is like cold and rainy after you've had like really good weather, it just hits you hard. And that one really, really banged me up pretty good. Not happy about this weather right now. Alan C. says SEC basketball this year is as deep as I've ever seen it. Yeah, I mean, obviously conferences now are a lot different than they used to be. But you want to go back to like the glory days of the Big East, ACC of the 80s. To have this level of depth in one league, I mean, I'm not quite so sure that this SEC isn't the deepest league of all time. Different type of thing because there's just so many more teams in conferences now. But you've got at least 4 championship contending teams. You've got a lot of other teams that are kind of, potential like Sweet 16 type teams, and a bunch of teams that could at least be in the conversation for making the tournament. It's wild. Sebastian Clark pointing out the Falcons did eventually bring in Gurley too late, and then he had that one game where he didn't go down instead of going for a touchdown. Ended up probably costing Atlanta the game, yeah. Garrison Tucker says, since the Kirby Smart era began, who do you think has been the most impactful player to wear the G? I think that Brock Bowers is the easiest answer on that because, and this is one of those things you'll wonder about for this upcoming year. Georgia had its offensive issues pre-Brock Bowers. And Georgia had its offensive issues in the first year post-Brock Bowers. Like during the Bowers era, Georgia was basically, one of the 2 or 3 best offenses in the entire sport. How much can you kind of replicate that in a post-Bowers era? So he is the one that I think is the easiest full and complete answer on that. Randy also mentioning Stetson Bennett. And yeah, Bennett certainly came along to stabilize a quarterback situation for Georgia that desperately needed some stability. So good stuff there. All right, final comments. We're going to get ready to go. Alan C. also mentioning Jalen Carter as an answer to that question. Yeah, it's funny. Carter plays as kind of a backup in 2021 and was injured for part of 2022. But when he was healthy and playing in 2022, that was the sort of one-man wrecking crew interior of the defense that made Georgia very hard to game plan against. Very hard to game plan against. Blind Squirrel Sports kind of pointing out whether these were intentional trolls or just sort of accidental slip-ups, like the Falcons when they drafted Kyle Pitts, putting out a picture of him scoring a touchdown against Georgia. That's the sort of thing that you just shouldn't do. You just shouldn't do that. You should not, and I think I made mention of this at the time, you should not aggravate the largest potential constituency that you have. You just shouldn't. And that's an unforced error. And there have probably been several of those by the Falcons over the years. The NFL is bigger than college football. It is. No one disputes that. But there are places, including Georgia, where college football is bigger than the NFL. And Atlanta just has to make peace with that and sort of manage its local marketing with the understanding of way more people care about Georgia football than they do the Atlanta Falcons. Way more people do. You may have one of the 32 NFL franchises in the NFL, maybe the biggest deal in all of sports, but on our little street corner here, college football is a much, much bigger deal. All right, let us see before we go. Anything else? All right, good stuff. Appreciate everybody being here, as always. Always nice to see nice things. Brian Whitaker checking out says, have a great day, BA and Dog family. Brian, hope you do too, and hope you all do. And of course, we appreciate our friends at RS Andrews who make the show possible. You can find RS Andrews, make this portion of the show possible, I mean to say. You can find RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electrics. As Melissa said a little earlier, it's not spring weather today, but spring will be here before you know it, which means it's not too soon to start thinking about getting that air conditioning unit tuned up to factory fresh specs. RS Andrews can take care of you on that and keep you feeling cool and comfortable as the warm weather eventually arrives. So think about RS Andrews on that. The RS stands for rapid service. Find them online, rsandrews.com. All right, I'm going to get completely untangled here, and then I'll see you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily presented by ServPro. We'll talk to you then.